All right, it is time for us to get started. Running a little bit behind tonight, but we'll try to catch up. We're going to be picking up where we left off last week in James chapter 5. That's James chapter 5. We made it down to verse 10. And if someone could read verses 10 and 11 right now. Verses 10 and 11 of James chapter 5. Whoever gets there first. 10 and 11.
Take my brethren, the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy.
All right, so we had just gotten off of the section where he was talking about, grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned. Behold, the judge standeth at the door. We had been talking about how the rich had been abusing some of the people that were under them, and God was specifically talking to those people through the pen of James and was warning them of what they were going to face and the realities of the terror, really, that was coming up against them because of how they had mistreated those people. And God was being sure to let them know this was completely unacceptable. This is not something I'm going to condone or allow. And he goes on, but he responds to the people who were suffering, the people who had dealt with these kind of things, and he gave a message for them as well, a way of trying to deal with these situations that are coming up against them. And what does he tell them? To not hold these grudges. Don't hold the grudge against these people. That's not your job. It's my job to take care of this. You keep doing your work. You keep doing what you're supposed to be doing, and I'll take care of the rest. Which, if we go throughout human history, especially in the history of the Scriptures, that is something that mankind has struggled with as far as there has been man. Because if you think about it from our perspective, how easy is it for you just to let someone else take care of something that your name is going to be attached to? Or that's going to have consequences for you? I see people who are just cringing right now, and it is such a great example of this. It's so hard to do. Because if that's going to have my name attached to it, or if it's going to affect me in some way, I'd rather just do it myself. If I do it myself, I know it's done the way I want it done. I jokingly say this. I grew up in a great, loving home, but the kitchen was off limits. The kitchen was completely off limits. The kitchen was for Mom and her cooking, and you did not mess with that. That was her area. And that's just the picture that comes to mind with these kind of things, is if I got to trust someone else to handle it, I've got to put a lot of trust in them. I've got to put a lot of confidence in them to take care of this. But what they're putting their confidence in is the Lord. They're saying, God, I'm going to trust you to take care of this. I'm going to trust you to take care of the problems that have been facing these people. I'm going to let you take care of these evil guys. And even the prophets struggled with this as well. They struggled with understanding it. They say, God, the nation of Israel or of Judah, they're wicked. The people around them are wicked. How on earth are you going to deal with this? And God says, don't worry, I got it. I'll take care of this. And so when we go down to this next section in verse 10, he says, take my brethren the prophets. He's giving an example of what was taking place and of what these people were going through. He says, take my brethren the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Imagine if someone, a preacher or someone along those lines, pointed out to a group of people and said, hey, I'm going to pick on Robert. Take Robert for an example of how to deal with suffering and persecution. That doesn't sound like a compliment today. It's, okay, I don't want to have to suffer. I'm glad that I may have done something that can help you, but I don't want to have to be the example of this. But that's exactly what took place with these people. I mean, we just go through a quick summary of what was shown in the Old Testament with these prophets. Think of Elijah for a moment. In 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 14, what's the first thing we read? That there were people who wanted to take his life. Why? Because he preached the truth. They killed the prophets of Baal. They won a massive victory for the Lord. And Queen Jezebel wasn't going to have any of it. She wanted to take his life. How dare you try to take away my power? Or we go to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 38, verse 6. Jeremiah was thrown into literally a waste dump. That's what the mire that's being talked about there is, waste. And he was going to drown in it. That was the goal. They wanted him to drown in that. Or we go over to Daniel in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel's living a righteous life. He's growing in favor with the king Darius. And what is his fellow princes, what do they want to do? Get rid of him. We want to get rid of him. So the only way we know we can get rid of him is if we make it a crime to follow his God. Think about that's a compliment though, is it not? The only way we can get this guy is if we outlaw his religion. That's a pretty powerful statement to Daniel's character and to who he was in a pagan nation. Not in any other nation. He was in a place of prominence in a pagan nation, not only a pagan nation, but a pagan nation that destroyed the pagan nation he was in. He caught all these different positions. But it doesn't just stop with the Old Testament either, because we hear this statement used again in Acts chapter 7, verse 52, where Stephen is standing before the council, and what does he tell them? Your fathers, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? Let's try to put this in our terms today. A preacher goes before a congregation, he stands up to preach a sermon, and before this whole congregation he says, okay, which preacher have you ever had that you've not mistreated? We talked about moving sermon Sunday. He wasn't even hired and he would move. That's about how that would play out. But that's the exact situation. These preachers were going in, these prophets were going into a nation that did not want to hear what they had to say. It's kind of interesting to go through the Old Testament and read the prophets and how so few of the things they spoke were positive things. There was very little of what the prophets were sent to do or sent to preach that was good. Most of the time it was, you've sinned against God, you're going to be destroyed. Or you've you've killed children, you're going to be punished for this. Or you're worshiping false gods, you're going to have to face consequences for that. And this was oftentimes while the nation was doing well. Not while the nation was in suffering and torment. It wasn't while the enemy was outside the gates. No, this was when they had all the wealth and power and prominence and prestige. They had everything they could have wanted. But the prophets are coming and saying all of this is going to be burned down around you. Not a very popular group of people. But we go down to verse 11. He says, behold, we count them happy which endure. You have heard of the patience of Job and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. He says, all those people we just read about, all the suffering that they went to and went through in that situation, we can count them happy. Count them as glad people, happy people. Why? Because they knew who God was. And they knew that if they endured, they knew what they were going to receive as a result. If they stayed the course, they knew that God was pitiful and of tender mercy. Now, we use the word pitiful very differently here in the South. If I say the word pitiful or say, oh, he's pitiful, probably talking about the guy who got his leg bit off. That's probably what we're talking about. Oh, that's so pitiful. Or the three-legged dog walking down the street. That's probably what we think of when we think of that term. But what does that word actually mean? Compassionate, full of pity. Pitiful, full of pity. That's what it means. God has pity for those who are suffering. He looks on them and says, that is unacceptable. That's not good. I have compassion for them. What happened with the lepers that came to Jesus? What did Jesus do for them? He healed them. But he even went a step further than just healing them. He didn't sit back and go, hey, you're healed. He went up and he touched them. Now keep in mind, if you were a leper in that day and age, that's a death sentence. That's said and done. And it's going to be a long, painful process. You had no contact with people. If you came across people, you had to tell them that you were a leper and have them go on the other side, walk away from you, avoid you. So the fact that Jesus touched them, that was probably the first time since they were diagnosed with their disease that anyone had touched them. That's a pretty powerful moment for them. But that's who Jesus was. Jesus had compassion for these people. And so he says he is pitiful and of tender mercy. He takes pity on these people. Think about what he did with Job. Job went through all the things that he went through after God had bragged on him. God had said, have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him in all the earth. And what does the devil say? Well, he only serves you because you bless him. If you take away his blessings, he's not going to serve you anymore. And God said, okay, let's test this theory. Go ahead, prove your point. And so what does the devil do? He takes away his wealth, he takes away his position, he takes away his family. His wife was still there with him, but she was telling him, just curse God and die. In spite of all of that, what does it say? Ye have heard of the patience of Job. Patience. He stayed in spite. He followed God in spite of all the pain, suffering, difficulty, and loss that he went through. And God blessed him as a result. But then we get down to verse 12. He says, but above all things, brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. What some people like to do with this situation is some like to describe this in reference to only cursing or using bad language. The reality of this is it's specifically set aside for something else. There's other verses we can go to talk about the other side of things, but this is not a good place to go for this. This is a description of oaths that were made by the people of that day. What they would do is they would make oaths based on something of value or spiritual significance in order to really reinforce what they're saying. They say, hey, did you hear what happened to the Roman emperor? Oh, that ain't true. No, I swear on the temple. Kind of see what he's getting at here? He's saying you don't make oaths neither by heaven, neither by earth, neither by any other oath. That one's ironic in of itself. They would make oaths based on oaths they've made. But he says, neither by any oath, but let your yea be yea, and your nay, nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. Now, this is not the first time we read about this topic. It's not the first time that a Christian or one who is teaching the new covenant of the Lord mentions this about oaths. In fact, we can go into the New Testament as well. Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, Jesus describes this in the Sermon on the Mount of not making foolish oaths. He told them that their word should be their bond. True or false? There's an issue with your life if someone can't take you at face value with what you say. And I said can't for a reason. I'm not saying, because there's some people who are just naturally distrustful. I'm talking about they can't take you at face value. How quick am I to make a statement about something without having checked it? Without having gone back and really thought about what was said or verified what was said? Now, I'll be the first one to tell you I've been guilty of that before. And I think many of us have. Because we'll go on and we'll be scrolling through Facebook one day, or if we're younger, it might be through Instagram or TikTok or something, be scrolling through and you'll come across a story. Hey, did you hear about this story? Did you hear what just happened here? Just for it to come out a few days later, oh, that was a false story. Yeah, that was just made up. Friends, what we say, what we tell people about each other, about other people, matters. It matters. Because we might think, oh, that doesn't have any consequence, but the reality is our words can destroy someone. Or it can build them up. It's a valuable tool, or it is a devastating weapon. We talked about that earlier on in the book of James, and James is again going back into this point. He says, when you open your mouth and affirm something, it better be true. It better be true. Is that a problem we face in 2024 America or the 2024 American church? Is that a problem that we deal with? Every day we deal with that kind of stuff. Now here's where the rubber meets the road though. Am I responsible for part of that? Because it's very easy to look and say, oh yeah, yep, we got a problem with this. It's a lot harder to look in the mirror and say, I'm guilty of it, or I've allowed it to happen with me. James is not talking, he's talking to a wide group of people, but he's meaning for you to put yourself in there too. The people who he's writing this to, it's meant to be personal. We talked about that from the very beginning. The book of James is a book that hits you right square in the chest. Because every one of these statements he makes unapologetically, and he does not sugarcoat what he says either. He means it very directly to these people. He says, this is not something you are to be engaged in. Notice this, lest ye fall into condemnation. It's more than just a whoops. Friends, he said this is a condemnable offense. We wouldn't look and say, oh, look at that. I accidentally killed someone. That's a shame. No, we say, oh no, what do I do? It's a very serious thing. I've just taken a life. But a lie is held in the same category with murderers. A lie is held in the same category as homosexuals. A lie is held in the same category as all of these wicked things that we would hold to, but it's right there with it. He's trying to really help these people to see the realities of the world around them and the realities of what their actions actually mean. And that's really what the entire book is about, is it not? He's trying to talk to people who are scattered abroad and tell them your actions have consequences. You are supposed to be helping one another through this difficult time. Don't be engaging in the thoughts of the world. Focus on what is good. Remember the source. So that ends this section. The next section, it starts in verse 13. Are there any comments or questions before we move on to the next section? As some people say, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, let's go ahead and pick up starting in verse 13. And we will go, let's go to verse 15, 13 through 15.
Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sin, he will be forgiven.
Okay. So he transitions from dealing with these moral shortcomings to really just dealing with practical advice. He says, is any among you afflicted, struggling, suffering, having something wrong with you? Let him pray. Sounds like a really simple description, is it not? Hey, are you having a bad day? Are you suffering? Are things going very wrong in your life? Pray about it. One of the most fascinating things to me as a preacher is when people come and they're looking for advice and they're trying to figure out what to do about something, and they'll ask and they'll say, well, what do I need to do? And I said, have you prayed about it yet? Well, no, I hadn't thought to do that yet. It might take you 2 minutes. It's okay to take a little prayer, but we forget about it. It's the one forgotten tool that we have. And it is a way to specifically communicate with Almighty God. The very being who said, let there be light, wants you to talk to him. But we forget. We forget about it. There's a lot of times that we struggle with things that we can't see happen immediately. And there's a great example of this, especially for people of my generation. And yes, I'm going to call myself out right now. But my generation struggles with this immensely. The idea of saving money in an appropriate way. It is a difficult thing. It is. It's a very difficult thing. But it's not just only my generation. I'm not going to say it's only my generation. I said especially my generation. But why is it so hard? Because I put away money right now. I see all the bills, I see the bank account coming down, and I'm just like, well, it doesn't really help me that much. It's just $5. What they don't see is the interest that you're getting when you put it into certain accounts. They don't see that value. You've heard the descriptions from people, right? If you save 1 penny and it gets this amount of interest, then this amount of pennies eventually becomes like this many thousands of dollars. But we don't see that because I'm like, I want the Big Mac. It's right here. I'm hungry. DoorDash is so convenient. But when it comes to prayer, we do the same thing. Because I say, well, it's just a prayer. I'm just going to talk to myself in the room. That's a problem right there. Not acknowledging there's someone else listening. Prayer is a powerful tool. And he says, if you are afflicted, if you are suffering, if you're going through difficulty, pray to God. He said, is any among you merry? What does he say? Let him sing psalms. I heard a guy on one occasion say that he doesn't like singing because he sounds, well, I'm just going to say he couldn't hit a tune in a bucket. And the reality is, as much as I wanted to argue with him on that statement, I would be a liar if I did. He struggled with singing, but boy, he would sing all the time because he read this verse. He said, if you're merry, sing psalms. He said, especially when no one's around, I'll be screaming in my car. He said, it might sound ugly, but it's only me and God right there. Singing is actually a very important part of expressing yourself. Expressing yourself to God, relieving stress, all these many different aspects, it really does help. And it is excellent for education. There's several of us in here who are teachers. How many times did you yourself learn something or teach someone else using a song? A lot. A lot. I've been a preacher for 3 years now, went to Memphis School of Preaching for 2 years, and I still sing the books of the Bible. If I'm trying to get to one of the difficult ones in the Old Testament, I will still sit there and I'm like, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. I'm going through trying to find out where that is. It's a valuable tool. We learn that way. We learn lessons that way. Do you think it's an accident that there are so many cultures out there who record their history in songs? That's a way so that people can remember it. They'll know what took place there. There's some of us out here who might even remember, if you maybe heard of the Edmund Fitzgerald, the ballad of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It's the longest song and no one remembers all the words. But you know about that because of the song. Very few of us would have gone back. What was that? Unless you lived in Michigan, then everyone knows about it. But that's a way that we learn. And that's why God described it this way. Ephesians 5:19, sing and make melody in your hearts to the Lord. Colossians 3:16, sing. What do? What are we supposed to do? Teaching and admonishing one another in songs, hymns, and spiritual songs. Singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. That's a way we can do these things. But then we get down to the part of this chapter which many people struggle with. And it is complicated at face value. But let's notice what he says, verse 14. Is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith shall save the sick, and the Lord shall raise him up. And if he have committed sins, they shall be forgiven him. There's a couple important factors to look through in this section, because there's a lot of people who read this section of Scripture and they say, see, miracles still exist. Because God gave a command that the elders were supposed to do this, and it's supposed to... Okay. First of all, what time frame is this written in? The time of miracles. The time when this was still taking place. We go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, what do we read? There's coming a better way. In fact, he goes so far as to say, when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. The verse right before that, he describes how, is there prophecy, it'll vanish away. He describes all these different aspects that Paul's trying to get across to these people, because we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, they were arguing over it. Well, I'm better than you because I have the gift of prophecy. Well, I'm better than you because I have the gift of healing. And he says, what good is that? He said, what good are these miracles if you don't have love? What good are these gifts that God has given you in order to teach the lost if you are not focused on what is right? Which was, he said, there's coming a better way, love. Because love encompasses all aspects of what it means to be Christian. Love tells you you're wrong. Love encourages you when you're struggling. Love keeps you grounded when things are becoming difficult around you. So he gets to this point, he talks about, is any sick among you, let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him. Now, we can go into the history of this and say, well, oil was used as a medicinal product at times, and we're not talking about that in this situation. This appears to be far more symbolic than it appears to be actually physical. But what these men were doing was they were coming to pray over these people and they would be healed. This was the prayer of faith. This was a gift that was used to these people back in the day. But there's a really fascinating thing that comes up at the very end of this passage. It says, and if he have committed sins, they shall be forgiven him. Why is it important to differentiate someone being sick and someone being sinful? Why would that be important to mention? What was that? Addressing that thought. They're addressing that thought. That was a very common belief in early Christianity because most of them came from Jews. There was a common Jewish belief that said if misfortune comes upon you, it's because you were a sinner. If wealth came upon you and blessings came upon you, it was because you were a good person. So what James is differentiating here and really helping us to understand is he said, those things aren't mutually inclusive. He said, if he were sick, he will be healed. And if he committed sins, added to that thought, showing a differentiation between the two. He's helping us to understand that's not the result of it. Just because my loved one got cancer or I got cancer or something like that doesn't mean I'm a wicked person. People get sick. People suffer. People go through difficulties in their life, and he's trying to show the contrast there. Then we get down to verse 16, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another that you may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Then he goes into verse 17 and 18, saying, Elias was a man subject to like passions as we were, and he prayed earnestly that it might not rain, and it rained not on the earth by the space of 3 years and 6 months. This passage that we are noticing here, he's recording here, was in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1, where Israel had rejected God, had sinned against God, and Elijah prayed for this famine to come up, this rain not to fall upon them. It would cause a famine, punishment for their sins. That's what was taking place here. And he's describing how these prayers that he was offering, that they had value. There were actions that were brought about because of this. He said, Elijah was just a man. He wasn't anybody special. He was just a human being like you and me. And I think it's interesting that he describes it subject to like passions. What do we see Elijah doing whenever Jezebel wanted his head? Oh God, just take my life. I can't do this anymore. It's just too much. He forgot the fact that God literally sent fire down from heaven on Mount Carmel. But it's easy for us to say that. It's easy for us to say, Elijah, you just called fire from heaven. What's wrong with you? But if we were in the same position and someone said, I'm coming to get you, if Joe Biden put the most wanted list and your name was on there, that would be disconcerting. It'd be a little bit stressful. And that's what he was showing here. He says he was subject to like passions as we are, yet he prayed. Then verse 18, and he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth brought forth her fruit. Again, it's just an illustration. These people were mostly what nationality? Jews. Mostly Jews. Do you think they would have known the story of Elijah? Very likely they would have. So, we are going to have to be very quick about this. But verses 19 and 20, Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one convert him, let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death, and shall hide a multitude of sins. we go through this entire section here, all these proverbs that James is giving people and trying to help them through these difficult times, all these descriptions of sin and its consequences, and it sums up with this one section. If one of you is struggling with what I've talked about before, and one of you convert him, bring him back, change his mind, refocus him, let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death and shall hide a multitude of sins. Friends, if that is not our focus, if that is not our primary focus when we're talking to the people in the world, we have missed the whole point. We struggle with, I don't want to hurt their feelings, or I don't want to get attacked, or I don't want there to be yelling, I don't want there to be problems, I don't want to face that difficulty. But friends, that is a life that is about to die. That is a soul that is about to meet eternity. And I might be the only person who can reach them. So that is the main summation of the book of James. James is trying to help these people remember the source, remember your focus, and avoid the pitfalls. And that really helps us to sum it up. Well, we finished the book of James. Hopefully next time we will be picking up in the book of Luke. So if you want to go ahead and start reading ahead, we'll start in the book of Luke. And we are going to try to have some handouts coming up soon for people to use for their own study habits. We're still trying to work out some of the kinks, but hopefully we'll be able to get that in the near future, and that'll help you have some of your notes on you at all times. But thank you so much for your attention. You are dismissed.